Earlier this week, after endless concessions to Senator Joe Manchin to basically get him to sign on to the budget reconciliation bill, he signaled that he just couldn't do it because he's allegedly concerned about how social spending will impact inflation.
Throughout the last 3 months, I've been straightforward about my concerns that I will not support a reconciliation package that expands social programs and irresponsibly adds to our $29 trillion in national debt that no one seems to really care about or even talk about. Nor will I support a package that risks hurting American families suffering from historic inflation.
Historic inflation is a funny way of putting it. And I'm going to get to an excellent piece that was written by Seth Ackerman in Jacobin to kind of help really put things in perspective, give people the important context necessary to understand this moment, especially if you look at, our recent history, fairly recent history with inflation. But what you're hearing from Joe Manchin there is something that's regurgitated over and over and over again in corporate media, especially in cable news.
We know that inflation is raging. We hear from so many CEOs, politicians, money managers, pundits. There's no sign of any commodity coming down, just up.
Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey bringing up hyperinflation in the last week, saying it's going to change everything, and it's happening.
If you're worried about inflation, it's a huge, huge issue.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Paul Tudor Jones, as always, is right about inflation. It's much worse than we thought.
Just completed 2 days of board meetings, and literally the topic du jour for each day was inflation.
I've been alarmed for a long time, and I'm more alarmed now.
Now, as many of you probably already know, the term inflation essentially describes when companies start raising the prices of their goods at the same time as people begin purchasing, at the same time that purchasing power is in decline, meaning that you spend more on whatever thing you're buying, right? So your dollar doesn't get you as far as it previously did. But considering all of the alarmist media that we're seeing right now, how do Americans actually feel about inflation? Do they see it as their top concern? This is where Seth Ackerman comes in with his awesome Jacobin piece, and he really does help to put things in perspective. So if you look at earlier this year, what percentage of Americans felt that inflation is the most important issue? Well, according to Gallup's most important problem page, the share of respondents who felt that high cost of living / inflation was the country's most important problem was as follows: just 1% in July, 2% in August, and then it dipped back down to 1% in September. Doesn't seem like Americans are buying the alarmist narrative. Now, Ackerman finds that there was, in fact, an uptick in concern among Americans during the month of October, which was likely the result of the relentless media coverage, coupled with the GOP campaigning on that very issue. So the share of Gallup respondents citing inflation as the country's most important problem in October has jumped to 5%. So if that seems high, have no fear, because historically speaking, it's not that high. To put that number in context, because not too long ago, concerns about inflation were actually far more pronounced. So more people were actually concerned about inflation from April to September of 2008, when the percentage citing inflation as the most important problem averaged about 9%. But even the 2008 numbers failed to capture the disconnect between the current mainstream media coverage of inflation and how concerned Americans really are about it. The last time Americans actually did consider inflation to be the number one problem in the country was in the 1970s. For instance, inflation was the number one concern of Americans for the whole of the year 1973, and then again in 1974. And again in 1975, and every year through 1981. Taking an average of all the Gallup polls over the course of the entire 9-year period, inflation was cited as the number one concern of not 5%, but 44% of respondents, because that was an era where Americans were experiencing hyperinflation in the economy. So that, by the way, hasn't stopped CNN or other news outlets from, basically taking this narrative, this alarmist narrative about inflation today and really running with it.
What does inflation mean for American families? This is the story of the Stotler's Weekly Shop.
Good to see you guys.
Good to see you.
We have 2 biological kids, and then my wife and I have a big heart for adoption, so we adopted a sibling group of 2, then 3, then 1, and then we have a kid living with us right now who's kind of in a foster situation.
It feels like money isn't going as far as it used to.
No, I mean, CNN could have chosen to talk to an ordinary family. The Stotlers, as wonderful as they are, is not a normal family in today's day and age. They've got a lot of kids. So going to an extreme to make a point about how awful inflation is kind of gives you a sense of what CNN is trying to do here. Now, this is where Milkgate happens, right? So if you've been on Twitter, you probably noticed most of the reaction to this particular CNN report is about milk, because they talk about just how many gallons of milk they buy in any given week in order to feed their family. Let's watch.
All right, now we're moving on to dairy, which is right there. We started seeing everything going up. Grocery prices went up. Gallon of milk was $1.99. Now it's $2.79. Well, when you buy 12 gallons a week, times 4 weeks, that's a lot of money. That's what I'm talking about. Thanks, brother.
Again, this is what they buy every week.
Again, not the typical family. But I do think it's important to do fact checking, even if you're having a discussion with a non-typical family that's complaining about inflation, because she noted some very specific prices there, what she used to pay for milk and what she finds herself paying for milk today. And if you look at the USDA's website on milk prices, you'll find that the reality is a little different. Did Kroger regularly sell milk for $1.99 a gallon? According to the USDA, the average in Dallas was $2.86 back in January, and now it's $3.22, a 15% increase. The nationwide average went from $3.57 to $3.60. It's important to know the actual numbers because they help to put things in perspective. The alarmist narrative, as scary as it might sound, doesn't really ring true when you look at the hard data. Now, later in the story, it was claimed that the family went from spending $150 to $200 per week on groceries to now $310 per week. And that's an insane level of inflation that should have been fact-checked as well, but they didn't fact-check it. So the indexes for food, shelter, and gasoline were key drivers of inflation growth last month. Of course, those items are key to the basic financial life of normal Americans, thereby stretching their bottom line even thinner. However, let's take a look at how much things have gone up in prices. New vehicles jumped 1.3% over the past month and are now 8.7% higher compared to 12 months prior, while gas prices shot up by 1.2%. Now, here's where CNN should have done its fact check, because grocery prices were 1.2% more expensive in September than in August, continuing an expensive trend. Over the past year, food is 4.6% more expensive. Shelter costs have risen by 3.2% during the same period. I give you those numbers because based on what the matriarch of the Stotler family said in that video, she's experiencing inflation close to like 55 to 100%. But that's not really something that's shown in the data. Inflation for groceries, inflation for food has gone up by about 4.6% specifically. And so when you take a step back and you look at the overall economy, it's actually easy to see that inflation hasn't even hit every single sector of the economy. It's actually limited. So that's good news. Current inflation is confined to a tiny section of the overall economy. But here's the bad news. The sectors hit the hardest do hurt ordinary Americans who are living paycheck to paycheck. So I'm not trying to underestimate the impact that inflation has on some families, but again, it's important to put things in perspective. So when you strip out volatile food and energy prices, so-called core CPI inflation, the picture was somewhat brighter. Prices rose by just 0.2% in September, slightly higher than in August, and climbed by over 4% over the last 12 months. That's still well above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, but not as high as recent months. So it is, by the way, worth taking a look at what's causing inflation, because Joe Manchin and other corporate goons like him would have you believe that inflation is caused by social spending, that giving Americans financial assistance during the pandemic, for instance, is negative to the economy because it drives inflation. But that's not it. If we look at what's causing inflation today, there are some causes that are transitory, and we'll get to those in just a minute. And then there are other causes that we're being told are transitory, but are not. And it has to do with the Federal Reserve's behavior. So let's start with cheap money, and then we'll get to supply chains and labor. So the issue of cheap money is an important one because essentially you have the Federal Reserve pumping money into the financial system. And that action is known as quantitative easing, and it's meant to provide liquidity to banks. In other words, capital to the financial markets. And the whole idea is that that money, that low interest, cheap money, is supposed to be passed down to small businesses and individual consumers, right? It's supposed to help them borrow as cheaply as possible. But that has not quite happened. As Bloomberg notes, the strategy is clear and deliberate. Snuff out volatility from the bond market and make debt the cheapest it's ever been to deter saving and encourage investment. The hope: cheap cash leads companies to invest and hire as rising asset prices make people more confident and ready to spend. Now, the inevitable side effect: more volatility for assets as investors, here's the important part, chase returns around the world. And of course, the risk: bloated asset prices pop, undermining financial stability before the real economy can benefit from all that cash. So one of the areas where we do in fact see quite a bit of inflation, I think it's actually the most noticeable, is in the housing market. And the Federal Reserve's activity in providing liquidity for banks and for corporations has led to these very financial institutions taking the money and trying to find a way to profit off of it further, not invested in their employees, not provide cheap loans to individuals or to small businesses, but to take that money and invest it themselves in order to get a higher return on their investment. So what are they doing? They're buying residential real estate, and then they turn that real estate into rentals in order to corner the rental market. And so we're seeing that play out both in the price of homes that families are looking to buy, but also in the price of rentals, because they are now kind of monopolizing the system by being these massive corporate landlords, while at the same time taking available inventory of homes to buy out of the market. And they're doing mass purchases. They now account for 1 in 5, 20% of home purchases in the country. I'm talking about I'm talking about institutional investors here. So cheap money provided by the Federal Reserve is certainly part of this inflation story, and you're less likely to hear about that among our lawmakers or even in the corporate media. Now, the Federal Reserve claims that it will taper its quantitative easing program beginning this month. That would also translate to higher interest rates for working Americans. So it's a tricky balance that only gets scarier when you consider the fact that the Fed is a government agency with unelected individuals who have a massive impact on our financial well-being. Well, now let's move on to supply chain issues, because that is also contributing to the inflation that Americans are experiencing today. The coronavirus pandemic really highlighted the vulnerabilities in our global supply chain. That very breakdown in the supply, coupled with an increase of consumer demand, obviously has an impact on prices for some products. So while I have no love for the guy Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell is right in citing the causal relationship between supply chain bottlenecks and inflation.
The key factor globally continues to be getting past the pandemic. The Delta variant forced a number of countries to re-implement restrictions, which slowed the recovery and further interrupted global supply chains. Those effects are diminishing now, but as economies reopen, supply bottlenecks are still weighing on production in some industries and boosting prices, contributing to that higher inflation. So as the Delta cases decline, we do expect progress to speed up, although we can't rule out the possibility of another spike this winter. Here in the U.S., it's a very similar story. Very strong demand this year, on track for 5% growth. Like elsewhere, the Delta variant temporarily slowed the economy's progress in the third quarter, keeping people from resuming public activities and in some cases from returning to work. Job growth slowed sharply. Q3 GDP is going to come in lower than we thought.
Now, we'll get to labor in just a moment, but before we do, let's focus on what Jerome Powell said about the supply chain. And also keep in mind that there are specific sectors that are impacted with inflation. So we're talking about things that Americans need: food, shelter, cars, transportation to get around from point A to point B. And so while the supply chain or the supply side of the economy is in fact struggling, Americans still need to consume these things, right? These are things that Americans need. And so after a brief dip at the beginning of the pandemic, people have embraced both e-commerce and brick and mortar retail as pandemic restrictions have eased. That's good for an economy blitzed by COVID-19, but it's also created its own set of challenges in the form of a backed up supply chain that wasn't built to weather a pandemic. So the supply chain issues were apparent from the very beginning of the pandemic as well, because the system incentivizes maximizing profits. And in order to maximize profits, many of these corporations refuse to have warehouses stocked with their goods. Usually what they do in order to avoid paying storage fees is, as soon as you have a transaction, that's when the product will be, essentially either created or made ready for you. So during the pandemic, shuttered or understaffed factories couldn't produce what people needed, and large manufacturers didn't have reserve supplies because they weren't designed to operate that way, meaning goods like toilet paper and hand sanitizer were missing from grocery store shelves. And again, let me just reiterate, to save money, companies avoid storage fees, which means that they do not have inventory of products just laying around in a warehouse somewhere. Many businesses operate on a hair trigger on-demand principle. They tend to make only what is projected to meet demand, because storing excess product in case of a supply chain or other crisis means manufacturers are spending more money on storage facilities, which they then can't spend elsewhere. This is the important part, including on bonuses for executives or dividends for shareholders. So again, we have yet another situation where the profit motive that really fuels capitalism works against us, right? Because again, they're looking to save money. They're not going to store product. They're going to find a way to do their operations as cheaply as possible. And then we go to the issue of labor. And I would argue that would be the most important issue. And this should be a huge wake-up call for those who have underestimated the important role of labor in making our economy work. Earlier, Fed Chair Jerome Powell also mentioned labor, which is a big part, probably the most important part of the supply chain. Without workers, everything breaks down. So there's been a labor shortage as people fall ill or have to care for sick relatives, juggle childcare and work, or understandably refuse to work for low wages in unsatisfactory conditions during a pandemic. And we've talked about that quite a bit here on Jacobin, at Jacobin. We've talked about the various strikes that have happened, the John Deere workers who are striking. In fact, you've likely heard a lot about how labor shortages are taking a toll on the service sector, right? But there's also a shortage of truck drivers who happen to be a critical part of the supply chain.
Most of the nation's goods are transported by truck. Drivers are in demand, and they're commanding higher salaries, up 25% since 2019.
In a couple of years, I'd like to hit the six figures.
So there's a lot of interest in your driving school right now?
Yes.
But Harbor Trucking School owner Luis Franco says none of his drivers could get licenses for months when the pandemic hit because the Department of Motor Vehicles shut down. And even now, it can take months to get an appointment.
The DMV needs to make it a priority in order for them to get out there on the road and start making money.
Right now, it's about putting products back on store shelves.
I think there are cost issues, particularly when you talk about labor costs for the third shift. On the other hand, what is the cost of doing nothing? We now see what that is.
So while you have these partisans in Congress trying to blame this on the other side and make this some sort of partisan political issue, while you have people like Senator Joe Manchin claim that providing more financial relief to Americans is what's causing inflation, don't allow them to use some ridiculous faux scapegoat in explaining what's happening with inflation. First, I think the important thing is to put it in perspective and not allow the alarmist commentary, analysis, and news coverage to get to you. But more importantly, understand what drives inflation, why it's happening, so you can really assess for yourself whether this is something that's temporary or something that's long lasting. Really, the Federal Reserve has had the biggest impact on inflation, especially when it comes to the housing market. But this also really shows the vulnerabilities of our supply chain, something we've talked about previously, and more importantly, just how little workers have been undervalued previously. They are the most important part of this economy. Without workers, nothing functions appropriately. And I'm really, really proud of the workers who are demanding more, especially at this rare moment where they tend to have more leverage than usual. Kale.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. And, Anna, I just thought inflation was when, your money just kind of magically, naturally just becomes less valuable over time. Isn't it just one of those automatic things in life?
If you're watching cable news, you probably will believe that. Yeah.
I mean, that is that's part of, I think on the one hand, it's understandable that most people don't understand what's going on when it comes to inflation because it's really kind of complex, and it's largely forces that have to do with businesses trying to make a profit and trying to realize that profit, and then coordinating with all other businesses simultaneously. And can they all realize the possible profit based on the capacity of their production right now and all of that kind of stuff. And so most people, understandably, they see money and they think well, this clearly has some special property about it where it can get you things, but it also has a shifting value. It's not always, milk today was, $3 or something a couple of months ago. Maybe I remember buying it for $2.50 or something, and the fact that these prices are shifting, it makes sense that this is all really confusing. And like you're saying, I mean, the people who actually do this, look at this information, people in CNBC or whatever, have nothing to offer to help clarify what any of this means. Because, at some level, I think fundamentally, I don't think they know what it means. I think Jerome Powell probably knows what it means. The people, the actual people, the people that companies are hiring to study this stuff probably know what it means. The right is always going to have smarter people than the left. I'm sorry. It's just that they also have horrific incentives to crush everyone. And so because fundamentally it's it isn't personal. It's just it's competition. They have to make money. And so that's where I think you're totally right. I mean, between, inflation, and cheap money being attached to homes and converting them into rentals. I think I kind of remember something not too long ago where all of these banks were bundling up cheap homes, and people bought them thinking, this is a safe investment. I don't know. It might be worth remembering that a little bit more and considering what the implications were in that situation. But
right.
And just the supply chains, the fact that companies, like the fact that it still boggles the mind, like this like just in time production where goods are only available not like barely seconds before sometimes like they're not ready before you've purchased. Like they might have an idea maybe someone's going to purchase this, but most of the time they're going to make it when you purchase it. And that is insane. Like that's like a horrific way to run a system when all of a sudden some exogenous force comes in and kind of throws that out of whack. And now so the fact that companies are scared that like I don't know if I'm going to make a profit anymore because we've built an entire economic model on this like highly precarious situation. And they did it because they had to do it because of competition. Like no one rationally would make this system. It's horrific. And now we all end up suffering the consequences.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And if you find yourself like really impacted, because look, the economic reality for a lot of Americans has not changed during the pandemic or has only gotten worse, right? And I think that those are the people who never get any type of news coverage. And so a little bit of inflation does impact them, especially when you look at the sectors of the economy that have seen an uptick in prices. And so one of the things that I've been trying to be better about, and I think I've actually kind of mastered it, to be honest, is when you're looking for a product and you're noticing that either the prices are astronomical or the shelves are empty, like think about secondhand purchasing, which I've been doing more and more of lately, like Christmas ornaments this year, for instance. I bought them secondhand. Like, why not? Like they're Christmas ornaments. There's a lot of really great resources for clothing, and it's like far more sustainable and far better for the environment to find stuff that's been lightly used but is in great condition instead of going out of your way to buy something that's more expensive and brand new. Like just like rethink the consumerism that I think we've all been conditioned to engage in from like the moment we were born. And think about how you can, first of all, save yourself money, but also act in a way that's also better for the environment. And that's not to put the onus on individuals to do something about climate change, but it's about like, hey, useful tips to not fall victim to like the constant advertising that tells you like you need to buy the next greatest, brightest, shiniest thing,
Right. Yeah, totally. And I know you'll agree with this, that like obviously fundamentally, we need to raise wages, and we need to like actually have at the national level like economic policy where in some ways like competition isn't always a bad thing. Like you want cheap prices. You just don't want cheap prices to mean that like capitalists have like squeezed workers into like a nub, and then they have no money to actually like buy any of this stuff afterwards.
Exactly.
And so like raising wages, having like unionization where like workers actually have far greater democratic control, but highly competitive firms that like keep prices down, as long as like we see the firm not as like this like, and not, this isn't like an optical problem, like, but if we change society where like firms were no longer like private dictatorships of, stockholders, and bosses that, they're just trying to maximize profit for their own sake because they get to decide what to do with the profit. But if we transformed it so that like, we just say, oh, this is just a social institution that produces things that we need and creates growth broadly in the economy. And we can harness this to then deliver what we need while also maintaining good living standards. Basically saying, we have a greater democratic say over what we do with the actual surplus, the actual profit that's produced at the end of the day. That's Sweden. That's what Sweden was doing. And it's like, that's why, again, when you want to like know why, like, it's like, why is it that they have like the greatest living standards and also like, are not like this horrible poor country, like that it's, they didn't have runaway inflation. They like had highly competitive internet multinational companies. And yet the actual population like has a good life, had a good life, has a good life. It's because of democratic control over the economic process that we got to decide, the workers got to decide what you do with the profit. And you don't just let bosses pocket it. You say you're going to invest in social programs.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And to be honest, I already had agreed with that, but the current situation with the budget reconciliation bill has made it even more pronounced. Like waiting for our lawmakers to ensure that workers' wages are fair. You're going to lose. You need to organize your workplace. I think labor unions it's really the only answer.
If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog, as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.